The air is thick with the stench of blood and antiseptic, a bitter tang that clings to my throat. I'm crouched in a canvas tent, the walls trembling from the distant thud of artillery shells. It's 1943, somewhere in the sweltering, mosquito-ridden jungles of the Pacific, and I'm an army nurse, my hands shaking as I press a bandage against a soldier's chest. His breaths are shallow, gasping, his eyes wide with terror, locking onto mine as if I'm his last tether to life. "Don't let me die," he whispers, his voice barely audible over the screams of the wounded outside. I want to promise him he'll live, but the truth is, I don't know. I don't know if any of us will make it through this night. Another explosion rocks the ground, closer this time, and the lantern above sways, casting jagged shadows across the faces of men who might not see dawn. I'm 24 years old, and I've already seen enough death to last a lifetime. But there's one moment, one question, that haunts me more than the blood, the screams, or the endless rows of broken bodies. A question asked in the chaos of that night by a man whose face I can't forget. Why did you save him and not me? That question is a splinter in my soul, a wound that never heals. It's not just about that night, or that soldier, or the choices I made under the roar of war. It's about a truth I uncovered in the heart of this conflict. A secret that changed how I saw everything: the war, the men I tried to save, and myself. What happened in that tent, in those frantic, blood-soaked hours, revealed something about human survival that no one talks about. Something that makes you question the very nature of life and death. Did I make the right choice? Could I have saved them both? Or was the truth I stumbled upon so much darker than I could have imagined? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why that question still keeps me awake at night. Why it forces me to relive every second of that jungle hell. War strips everything bare, your hopes, your fears, your humanity. It's a crucible where the best and worst of us are laid raw, where a single decision can mean life for one and death for another. I was just a nurse, trained to heal, not to play God. But in that tent, in the midst of a war that devoured millions, I faced a moment that showed me how fragile life is, how cruel fate can be, and how the choices we make in war can ripple through a lifetime. You might think you know what war does to people, but this story, this confession, will take you somewhere deeper, somewhere more unsettling. It's not just about survival. It's about what we're willing to sacrifice, what we're willing to hide, to keep going. I need you to stay with me until the end, because the truth behind that soldier's question isn't what you expect. It's not a simple tale of heroism or tragedy. It's something more human, more raw, and far more haunting. There's a twist in this story, a revelation that made me question everything I thought I knew about courage, loyalty, and the cost of survival. By the time we're done, you'll see war through my eyes, and you might not like what you find. Will you have the courage to face it? I'm asking you to connect with this story, to feel the weight of what I carried that night. If you're ready to hear the whole truth, hit that like button right now. It's not just a click, it's a signal that you want these stories, these raw confessions from the heart of war, to reach more people. Then, in the comments, write this: I want to hear the whole truth of this story. By doing that, you're joining a community that isn't afraid to look at the human cost of conflict, to honor the voices of those who lived through it. Thank you for having the courage to listen, to seek out the stories that others try to bury. You're part of something bigger now, a group of people who want to understand what war really does to the human soul. What comes next will pull you deeper into that night in 1943, into the choices I made, the lives I couldn't save, and the secret that changed me forever. Hold on, because this story is about to take you somewhere you've never been. The lantern's flickering light barely held the darkness at bay as I knelt beside Private Malone, my hands slick with his blood. The tent was a suffocating box of chaos, the air heavy with the metallic tang of iron and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Outside, the jungle roared with the sounds of war, artillery shells screaming through the night, their explosions shaking the earth like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast. Each blast sent a jolt through my chest, a reminder that death was never more than a moment away. I was trying to focus, trying to keep Malone's chest wound from bleeding out, but the noise, the cries, the sheer weight of it all made my hands tremble. I was a nurse, trained for this, But nothing in my training prepared me for the reality of a field hospital in the Pacific Theater. 1943. Nothing prepared me for the moment when I'd have to choose. Malone was young, maybe 19, with a freckled face that made him look like he belonged in a schoolyard, not a war zone. His lips moved, mouthing silent prayers or maybe calling for his mother. I couldn't tell. I pressed harder on the gauze, willing the blood to stop, but it seeped through my fingers, warm and relentless. "Stay with me, Malone," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're gonna be okay." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. His pulse was fading, his skin growing cold under my touch. The doctor, Captain Reynolds, was across the tent, barking orders to another nurse as he worked on a soldier with a shattered leg. There weren't enough hands, enough supplies, enough time. The wounded kept coming, carried in on stretchers or dragging themselves through the mud, their faces twisted in pain or blank with shock. Another explosion hit, closer this time, and the tent's canvas walls rippled like a living thing. Someone screamed outside, a sharp animal sound that cut through the din. I flinched, my hand slipping on Malone's chest, and for a moment I thought I'd lose him right there. But I pressed harder, my knuckles white, my arms burning. "Hold on," I said again, more to myself than to him. I couldn't let him go, not yet. I'd seen too many die already, their eyes staring into nothing as their last breaths rattled out. Malone wasn't just another patient. He was a kid, a boy who'd probably lied about his age to enlist, who'd written letters home about the adventure of war before it chewed him up and spat him out here. On my table, then I heard it, a shout from the triage area just beyond the tent's entrance. "Nurse, we need you now." It was Sergeant Hayes, one of the medics, his voice raw with urgency. I glanced over my shoulder, still holding pressure on Malone's wound. Through the tent's open flap, I saw them bringing in another soldier, his uniform torn and soaked with blood. He was thrashing on the stretcher, his screams piercing the night. "Shrapnel wound, critical," Hayes yelled. "He's an officer, priority." My stomach twisted. Priority. That word carried weight in a place like this, where rank could mean the difference between life and death. I looked back at Malone, his eyes half open, his breathing shallow but still there. I couldn't leave him, not now. But the shouts from the triage area grew louder, more desperate. "Nurse, he's bleeding out!" I froze, my hands still pressed against Malone's chest, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The officer, they didn't say his name, but I could see the insignia on his torn uniform as they carried him closer. A captain, someone important, someone whose survival might mean something to the war effort. But Malone was here, right in front of me, his life slipping through my fingers. I didn't know the officer's face, but I knew Malone's. I knew the way his voice trembled when he'd asked me earlier that day if he'd make it home to see his little sister. I'd promised him he would. I'd promised. "Damn it, nurse, move!" Hayes's voice snapped me back. I looked at Malone, then at the triage area, then back at Malone. My hands were shaking so badly now, I could barely keep the bandage in place. I didn't have time to think, to weigh the consequences. I had to choose. "Stay with me," I whispered to Malone one last time. Then I stood, my hands leaving his chest, the gauze soaking through instantly. I grabbed a fresh bandage and pressed it down, but I knew it wasn't enough. I called to another nurse, a young woman named Clara, who was tending to a less critical patient. "Clara, take over here," I shouted, my voice hoarse. She nodded, her face pale, and rushed to Malone's side. I ran to the triage area, my boots slipping in the mud. The officer was on a stretcher now, his face ashen, his eyes wild with pain. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, and blood was pooling beneath him, dark and glistening in the lantern light. "Hold him still!" I barked, my training kicking in even as my mind screamed at me to go back to Malone. I worked fast, cutting away his uniform, assessing the damage. The shrapnel had ripped through muscle and possibly organs. He was losing blood faster than I could think. I packed the wound, my hands moving on instinct, but his screams were deafening, each one a knife in my chest. I didn't know his name, but I knew he was someone's son, someone's husband, maybe someone's father. I couldn't let him die. Minutes passed. How many, I don't know. Time doesn't exist in a place like that. It's just a blur of blood and noise and desperation. I worked on the officer, stabilizing him as best I could, shouting for more supplies, more hands. Somewhere behind me, I heard Clara's voice, sharp and panicked. "He's crashing!" she yelled. I didn't need to ask who. My heart sank, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. The officer's pulse was weak but steady now. I'd bought him time, maybe enough to get him to surgery. I stepped back, my hands trembling. My apron soaked with blood. His, Malone's. I couldn't tell anymore. I turned to run back to Malone, but Clara was already there. Her hands still on his chest, her face streaked with tears. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I stumbled to his side, my knees weak. Malone's eyes were open, staring at the tent's ceiling, empty. His freckled face was still, too still. I reached out, my fingers brushing his cheek, but he was already cold. I'd left him. I'd chosen the officer, and now Malone was dead. The bombs kept falling, the wounded kept coming, and I had to keep moving. But as I turned back to the triage area, something broke inside me. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that choice, would haunt me for the rest of my life. And it wasn't just Malone's death that would stay with me. It was what happened later that night, when the officer I'd saved opened his eyes and asked me a question that would unravel everything I thought I knew. The jungle night pressed in around us, a suffocating blanket of heat and noise, as if the war itself were breathing down our necks. The tent was a furnace, the air thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and fear. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at Private Malone's lifeless face, his eyes still open, accusing me in their stillness. My hands were sticky with his blood, and my chest ached with a guilt I couldn't name. I'd chosen to save the officer, and now Malone was gone. I wanted to scream, to collapse, to run out into the jungle and let the bombs take me too. But there was no time for that. The wounded kept coming, their cries blending with the relentless thud of artillery in the distance. I had to keep going, had to push the image of Malone's face into some dark corner of my mind where I could deal with it later, if later ever came. I stumbled back to the triage area, my legs heavy, my vision blurred with tears I couldn't afford to shed. The officer I'd saved was still on the stretcher, his breathing shallow but steady. Captain Reynolds was with him now, preparing him for surgery. "Good work, nurse," he muttered without looking up, his hands moving with the precision of a man who'd seen too much death to be shaken by it. I nodded, but his words felt hollow. Good work? I'd saved one man and lost another. What kind of good was that? As I turned to grab fresh supplies, gauze, morphine, anything to keep my hands busy, I saw him. A soldier, barely older than Malone, limping through the tent's entrance, his arm slung over another medic's shoulder. His face was caked with mud, his eyes wide and glassy, like he'd seen something that had burned itself into his soul. His left leg was a mess, the fabric of his uniform shredded, blood dripping onto the dirt floor. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I rushed to him, my training taking over even as my mind screamed with the weight of Malone's death. I helped the medic lower him onto a cot, my hands moving fast to cut away what was left of his pant leg. Shrapnel had torn through his thigh, the wound deep and jagged, but not arterial. He'd live if I could stop the bleeding. "What's your name, soldier?" I asked, trying to keep him focused, to pull him back from the edge of shock. His lips trembled, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft I had to lean in to hear, he said, "Tommy. Tommy Carter." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "All right, Tommy, you're gonna be fine. Just stay with me." I worked quickly, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, stitching where I could. His hand gripped mine, his fingers cold and clammy, and I realized he was shaking, not just from pain, but from fear. "I saw it," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the tent's ceiling, as if he could still see whatever horror he'd witnessed out there. "I saw they were just gone, all of them. I didn't ask what he meant. I'd heard enough stories in this place to know that pushing for details could break a man before his wounds did. Instead, I kept talking, my voice steady even as my heart raced. "You're here now, Tommy. You're safe. Focus on my voice, okay?" He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. I glanced around, desperate for help, but Clara was still with another patient, and the other nurses were stretched thin. It was just me and Tommy, and I couldn't let him slip away. Not after Malone. As I worked, something strange happened. Tommy's eyes softened, and he looked at me, not with fear, but with something else, something almost like gratitude. "You're an angel," he whispered, his voice breaking. My ma. She said there'd be angels out here watching over us. I froze, my needle pausing mid-stitch. An angel? I was no angel. I was a woman covered in blood, haunted by the boy I'd failed to save just minutes ago. But Tommy's words hit me like a wave, stirring something deep inside, something I hadn't felt since I'd arrived in this God-forsaken jungle. For a moment, amidst the chaos, the screams, the endless parade of broken bodies, I felt human again. Not a machine stitching wounds, not a cog in the war's grinding wheel, but a person, connected to another person, both of us clinging to life in a place that reeked of death. I finished stitching Tommy's leg, bandaging it as best I could with the dwindling supplies. His hand was still in mine, and I squeezed it gently. "You're gonna make it, Tommy," I said, and this time I believed it. He smiled, a small, fragile thing, and for a moment the tent didn't feel so suffocating. But that moment didn't last. Another explosion rocked the ground closer than before, and the lantern above us swung wildly, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Tommy's smile vanished, his eyes darting to the tent's entrance. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're still out there." I didn't know who they were, Japanese soldiers, the ghosts of his fallen comrades, or something else entirely. But his fear was real, and it clawed at me, pulling me back into the reality of where we were. I wanted to stay with him, to keep that fragile connection alive, but the shouts from the triage area were growing louder again. More wounded, more blood, more choices I wasn't ready to make. I glanced back at the officer I'd saved, now being wheeled to surgery, and a knot tightened in my stomach. I'd saved him, but at what cost? And what would happen when he woke up? When he looked at me and asked the question that would shatter everything? As I stood to move to the next patient, Tommy's hand slipped from mine, and he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't leave me," he said, his voice desperate. "Please." I looked into his eyes, saw the terror there, and felt my heart break all over again. I wanted to stay, to be his angel, to keep him safe. But the war didn't care about what I wanted. It didn't care about Tommy or Malone or any of us. It just kept coming, relentless, hungry, demanding more than I had to give. I squeezed his hand one last time, then gently pulled away. "I'll be back, Tommy," I promised, hoping it wasn't another lie. As I moved toward the triage area, the weight of Malone's death and Tommy's fear pressed down on me, heavier than ever. But something else was stirring too. A nagging sense that the officer I'd saved wasn't just another patient. There was something about him, something I hadn't seen in the chaos, that would change everything. And when I heard his voice later that night, weak but clear, asking me that question, I knew I'd never be the same. The chaos in the tent didn't let up. It was a relentless storm. Each new wounded soldier a wave crashing against the fragile barriers we'd built to hold back death. I moved from Tommy's cot, my hands still tingling from his grip, and plunged back into the fray. The air was thicker now, if that was possible, laden with the moans of the dying and the sharp commands of the medics trying to impose some order on the madness. My apron was stiff with drying blood, my shoes squelching in the mud that had seeped in from the rain starting to patter against the canvas roof. I grabbed a tray of instruments, sterilized as best we could with boiling water and alcohol, and headed to the next patient, a sergeant with a bullet wound in his shoulder. His face contorted in agony as he clutched at the injury. "Easy there," I murmured, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I probed the wound, feeling for the bullet, ignoring the way his screams echoed in my ears like accusations. As I worked, my mind kept drifting back to the officer. He was in the makeshift surgery area now, behind a partition of hanging sheets that did little to muffle the sounds of Captain Reynolds's scalpel and saw. I'd saved him, or at least given him a fighting chance, but the cost, M. Malone's empty stare, gnawed at me like a rat in the dark. Why had I chosen him? Because he was an officer? Because the medics had shouted priority? Or was there something deeper? Some instinct that told me his life mattered more in the grand scheme of this bloody war? I shook my head, focusing on the sergeant's wound. The bullet was lodged deep, but I managed to extract it, the metal clinking into a basin like a grim trophy. He gasped in relief as I bandaged him, his eyes meeting mine with a gratitude that felt undeserved. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak, and moved on. The rain picked up, drumming against the tent like machine gun fire, adding to the cacophony. Water dripped through seams in the canvas, pooling on the floor and mixing with blood to create a slick, treacherous slurry. I slipped once, catching myself on a cot, and for a moment, I thought I'd fall into the abyss of exhaustion that threatened to swallow me whole. But I couldn't stop. Not with the line of stretchers outside growing longer, the medics shouting for more help, more morphine, more miracles. I tended to a private with burns from a flamethrower, his skin blistered and raw, his whimpers piercing my heart. Then a corporal with a head wound, his skull cracked like an eggshell, his chances slim. Each face blurred into the next. Each wound a variation on the theme of human fragility, torn apart by steel and fire. It was sometime after midnight, I'd lost track of the hours, when Captain Reynolds emerged from behind the sheets. His face haggard, his scrubs soaked with sweat and blood. He caught my eye and nodded toward the surgery area. "The officer's stable," he said, his voice rough. "He's asking for you." My heart skipped a beat. Asking for me? Why? I wiped my hands on a rag that was more blood than cloth and followed him back. The officer was lying on a cot, his abdomen bandaged heavily, an IV drip feeding him fluids. His eyes were open, though clouded with pain, and he turned his head slowly as I approached. He was older than I'd thought, maybe in his late 30s, with a strong jaw and lines around his eyes that spoke of years in uniform. His name tag, partially obscured by blood, read Lieutenant Harlan. "Nurse," he croaked, his voice weak but insistent. I knelt beside him, checking his bandages, making sure there was no fresh bleeding. "You saved my life," he said, his hand reaching out to grasp my arm. His grip was surprisingly firm for a man who'd been on the brink. I shook my head. "The doctor did the hard part," I replied, but he didn't let go. His eyes bored into mine, searching for something. "No," he insisted. "You chose me. Over the kid. Why?" My breath caught in my throat. How did he know? Had he been conscious during the chaos? I glanced at Reynolds, but he was already moving away, giving us space. I had to," I stammered. "You were critical. Priority." But Lieutenant Harlan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though it was more grimace than anything. "Priority," he echoed, his voice laced with bitterness. "That's what they call it. But you know better, don't you? You saw it. Saw what?" I leaned closer, my pulse racing. The tense noise seemed to fade, the bomb's distant thunder now. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He coughed, wincing, and I adjusted his pillow, but his eyes never left mine. "The war, it's not what they say, not heroes and villains. It's choices, ugly ones. Like the one you made." His words hit me like shrapnel, tearing through the defenses I'd built. I thought of Malone, his freckled face, his silent accusation. "I didn't want to," I admitted, the words spilling out. "But there wasn't time. I couldn't save you both." Harlan's grip tightened. "That's the secret," he whispered, his voice dropping even lower. "Sometimes you shouldn't try. Sometimes saving one means damning another, and I wasn't worth it." I stared at him, confusion swirling with the guilt. What was he talking about? He wasn't making sense, or maybe he was, and I just didn't want to hear it. The morphine could be talking, clouding his mind, but his eyes were clear, too clear. "You're alive," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "That's what matters." But he laughed, a dry, rattling sound that ended in a cough. "Alive for what? To go back out there? To make more choices like yours?" He paused, his breathing labored, and then he said it, the question that would haunt me. "Why did you save me, and not him?" The words hung in the air, heavy as the humid jungle night. I recoiled as if slapped. How could he ask that? He'd been unconscious, or so I thought. But he knew. Somehow he knew about Malone. I don't know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes for the first time that night. "I thought you were important. An officer." He closed his eyes, pain etching deeper lines on his face. "Important," he murmured. "That's the lie we tell ourselves. But there's more to it, something you don't know yet, about me, about why I was out there." His voice trailed off, and I thought he'd drifted into sleep. But then his eyes snapped open again. "Promise me you'll listen," he said, urgent now. "When I'm stronger. There's a truth here in this war that could change everything for you." I nodded, numb as another explosion shook the tent, reminding me that the war waited for no confessions. I stood, my legs unsteady, and left him there, his words echoing in my head. Why me and not him? It wasn't just a question. It was a key to something darker, something hidden in the shadows of this conflict. As I returned to the main area, checking on Tommy, who was sleeping fitfully, his bandaged leg elevated, I felt a chill despite the heat. Harlan knew something that made my choice feel like part of a larger nightmare, and as the night wore on, with more wounded pouring in, I couldn't shake the feeling that his revelation would break me more than any bomb could. But the war didn't give me time to dwell. A new wave of casualties arrived, their screams pulling me back into the grind. I worked through the pain, through the questions, but Harlan's words lingered, a promise of truth or torment to come. Little did I know, the next hours would bring a twist that would make his question feel like the least of my worries. The rain hammered down on the tent like an unending barrage, turning the ground outside into a quagmire of mud and blood that sucked at the boots of anyone daring to venture through it. Inside, the air was a choking mix of damp canvas, iodine, and the ever-present undercurrent of decay from wounds that festered too quickly in this tropical hell. I moved through the tent like a ghost, my body on autopilot as I checked IV lines, administered morphine to those whose screams had become too much for the rest of us to bear, and wrapped fresh bandages around limbs that might never heal. Lieutenant Harlan's words echoed in my head, a relentless whisper amid the cacophony, "Why did you save me and not him?" It wasn't just the question. It was the promise of something more, a truth he hinted at that made my skin crawl. I glanced toward the surgery partition where he lay, his form still and silent now, the morphine pulling him into a fitful sleep. What did he know? What secret could make my choice feel even more like a betrayal? I didn't have long to wonder. As I bent over a young private whose arm had been shattered by a grenade, adjusting his sling and murmuring words of comfort, I barely believed myself. Clara appeared at my side, her face drawn and pale under the lantern's harsh light. "The officer's awake again," she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the partition. "He's asking for you. Says it's important." My stomach nodded. Important. That word again, the same one that had pulled me away from Malone. I nodded, handing off the private to her, and made my way back to Harlan's cot. The tent seemed longer somehow, each step heavier, as if the mud outside had seeped into my soul. He was propped up slightly when I arrived, his face slick with sweat, his eyes brighter than before, feverish. Perhaps, or driven by whatever demon he carried. "Nurse," he rasped, motioning me closer with a weak hand. I knelt beside him, checking his pulse out of habit. It was steady, stronger than earlier. "You need to rest," I said. But he shook his head, his grip finding my arm again, fingers like iron despite his weakness. "No time," he muttered. "The bombs. They're getting closer. Listen to me." His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing me to lean in, my ear inches from his lips. The smell of his wound, sour and metallic, filled my nostrils, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "It started before this," he began, his words tumbling out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I wasn't always an officer. Joined up in 41, right after Pearl Harbor. Thought I was doing the right thing, fighting the good fight. But the Pacific, it's different. The jungle, the heat, the enemy you can't see until they're on top of you. It changes a man." He paused, coughing wetly, and I handed him a canteen, helping him sip water. His eyes met mine, haunted. "We were on patrol a few days ago. My unit, good men, most of them. We stumbled on a Japanese outpost. Small, but fortified. Orders were to take it out, silent if possible. But things went wrong. Always do." I listened, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a war story. There was an edge to his voice, a confession building. "We got in close," he continued, his breathing labored. "Knives, not guns, didn't want to alert the main force. I was leading, first one in, saw a soldier, young kid, couldn't have been more than 16. He turned, saw me, I hesitated. His grip tightened, his nails digging into my skin. Hesitated, and he raised his rifle. Shot my sergeant point blank. Good man, family back home. Dead because I froze." Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away. "I killed the kid after that. slit his throat. But it was too late. The shots brought the others. We fought, lost half the unit. I got hit running back, shrapnel in the gut. Made it to evac, but... He trailed off, his gaze distant, reliving it. I waited, the tense noise fading again, just his voice and the rain. "Why tell me this?" I asked softly. He focused on me, his expression twisting into something like regret. "Because you saved me," he said. "The man who hesitated, who got his men killed. That kid you left, Malone? He might have been a hero. But me? I'm a coward, a failure. Why me and not him? Because rank, orders, or because war makes us blind to who deserves to live?" His words sliced through me, sharper than any scalpel. I thought of Malone, his freckles, his plea to see his sister. Had I saved a coward over a boy with potential? But Harlan wasn't done. "There's more," he whispered, pulling me closer. "The outpost. It wasn't just soldiers. There were civilians. Women, children, hiding. We didn't know until after. My hesitation. It saved them, maybe. The kid shot alerted everyone. They scattered before the full assault. But my men died for it. The revelation hit me like a blast wave. Harlan wasn't just confessing cowardice. He was admitting to a moment where mercy and mistake blurred. His hesitation had cost American lives but spared innocence. Was that worth it? In the calculus of war, who decides? I sat back, my mind reeling. "You didn't know," I said, but he shook his head. "Doesn't matter. I failed my men. And you chose me, over Malone, who might have never hesitated." The guilt in his eyes mirrored my own, a shared burden now. I wanted to argue, to say choices in war aren't black and white, but the words stuck in my throat. Another explosion rocked the tent. This one close enough to make the lanterns swing wildly, shadows leaping like demons. Shouts erupted from the triage area, more incoming. I stood, torn between Harlan and duty. "I'll be back," I promised. But as I turned, his voice stopped me. "Nurse, my name's not Harlan." I froze. "What?" I looked back, confusion mounting. "It's Ellis. Lieutenant Harlan died in that outpost. I took his tags, his uniform, to survive, to get evac priority." His eyes pleaded for understanding, but all I felt was horror. He'd stolen a dead man's identity? To ensure he'd be saved first? The implications crashed over me. I'd chosen him because of that rank, that priority. But it was a lie. Malone died for a fraud. The tent spun around me, the rain's drumbeat matching my racing heart. Ellis reached out, but I pulled away. "Why tell me now?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Because you need to know," he said. "The truth. War's full of secrets like this. Men aren't who they seem. Choices aren't fair." I backed away, his confession burning in my ears. I'd saved a liar, a deserter perhaps, over an innocent boy. The question, "Why did you save him and not me?" took on new meaning. It wasn't Malone's ghost asking. It was my own conscience. As I rushed back to the triage, the weight of his secret pressed down, heavier than the humid air. But the night wasn't over. More wounded arrived, and among them, something that would twist the knife even deeper, forcing me to confront not just Ellis's truth, but my own role in this nightmare. The revelation from Ellis, his false identity, his hesitation in the outpost, the lives lost because of it, clung to me like the humid air, making every breath feel labored and heavy. I staggered back to the triage area, my mind a whirlwind of betrayal and doubt. How could I have saved him? A man hiding behind a dead officer's name, prioritizing his own survival over truth. Malone's death felt even more senseless now, a sacrifice for a lie. The rain continued its assault on the tent, the drops pounding like accusations against the canvas. Outside, the jungle was alive with the sounds of war, distant gunfire cracking through the night, the occasional scream of a shell overhead. Inside, the lantern light cast long shadows, turning the faces of the wounded into ghostly apparitions. I grabbed a basin of water, splashing my face to shake off the stupor, but the cold did little to clear the fog in my head. Shouts from the entrance snapped me back. "Incoming! Multiple casualties!" Sergeant Hayes bellowed, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. I rushed forward, joining Clara and the other nurses as stretchers flooded in, carried by medics slick with mud and rain. The new arrivals were from a recent skirmish, their uniforms torn, their bodies mangled by bullets and shrapnel. The air filled with their groans, a chorus of pain that drowned out everything else. I knelt by the first stretcher, A soldier with a chest wound similar to Malone's, his breathing ragged and wet. "Hold on," I murmured, my hands moving automatically to apply pressure. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying Ellis's confession. Priority, identity, choices, it all blurred together in a haze of blood and regret. As I worked, stabilizing the man as best I could before passing him to surgery, another stretcher caught my eye. The soldier on it was older, his face weathered, with a beard streaked in mud and blood. His right arm was gone below the elbow, the stump wrapped in a hasty field dressing that was already soaking through. But it was his eyes, sharp, alert despite the pain, that made me pause. He was scanning the tent, searching for something or someone. "Nurse," he rasped as I approached, his voice thick with a southern drawl. "You seen Lieutenant Harlan? Heard he was brought in earlier." My blood ran cold. Harlan. The name Ellis had stolen. I forced my expression neutral, focusing on his wound. "Let's get you fixed up first," I said, cutting away the dressing to reveal the ragged tear where his arm ended. Bone fragments gleamed white amid the red, and I swallowed hard against the nausea, but he wouldn't let it go. "Name's Sergeant Wilkins," he said through gritted teeth as I cleaned the stump. "From Harlan's unit. We were together at the outpost. Bastards ambushed us. Harlan led the charge, but hell, it went bad fast." I froze, my swab hovering over the wound. He knew the real Harlan? Or did he know Ellis? I glanced toward the surgery partition where Ellis lay hidden. "Tell me what happened," I said softly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Maybe this was the confirmation I needed, or the damnation. Wilkins winced as I applied antiseptic, but he talked, the words spilling out like blood from his arm. "We were scouting ahead, near the river," he began, his eyes distant. "Harlan, Lieutenant Harlan, he was point man. Tough son of a gun, always first in. Saw the Jap outpost, small but armed. Orders were to take it quiet. Harlan hesitated, though. Saw something, I think. A kid, enemy soldier, but young. Harlan froze, and the kid shot first. Killed our sergeant outright. Then all hell broke loose." His story matched Ellis's, but with a twist. He called him Harlan. Did he not know? Or was Ellis the real Harlan after all? No, Ellis had admitted taking the tags. My mind raced as I wrapped a tourniquet higher on his arm, preparing for amputation if needed. "Harlan got hit bad," Wilkins continued. "Shrapnel. We dragged him out, but lost track in the retreat. Thought he was dead, but if he's here?" I nodded, my throat tight. "He's here, stable." Wilkins's eyes lit up with relief, but then narrowed. "Good, man's a hero, you know." That hesitation saved lives. There were civilians in that outpost, women, kids. Harlan must have seen 'em. If he'd charged in blind, we'd have slaughtered 'em all. His pause gave him time to run. Cost us, but right thing. The words hit me like a punch. A hero? Ellis had called himself a coward, but Wilkins saw it differently. If Ellis had left his own tags on another body, what did that mean? Was it cowardice, desperation, or something else? I didn't have time to dwell. A shout from the entrance jolted me back to the present. "Nurse, prep for evac." It was Captain Reynolds, his voice hoarse, his eyes wild with something I hadn't seen in him before. Fear. I rushed to his side, dodging stretchers and medics scrambling in the dim light. "What's happening?" I asked, my heart pounding. He grabbed my arm, pulling me close. "Enemies advancing. Scouts say they're less than a mile out. We've got orders to move the wounded, now." The words hit like a shell. Evacuate? This wasn't just a field hospital. It was a lifeline. The only thing keeping these men from death. Moving them now, in the mud, with limited trucks and the enemy closing in, was a death sentence for some. I looked around at the cots, the faces. Tommy, sleeping fitfully. The private with the chest wound, barely stable. Wilkins clinging to life. And Ellis, fighting infection, his secret burning in my mind. "We can't move them all," I said, my voice shaking. Reynolds nodded grimly. "We prioritize. Officers, critical but stable. The rest?" He didn't finish, but I knew. The rest would be left to fate, or the enemy. I threw myself into action, my body moving while my mind screamed. We sorted patients. Those who could survive transport went first. I helped load the private with the chest wound onto a stretcher, his groans piercing as we jostled him. Tommy was next, his leg wound bandaged, but his eyes wide with terror as he sensed the chaos. "What's happening?" he whispered, clutching my hand. We're moving you to safety, I lied, forcing a smile. Safety was a fantasy in this jungle, with the enemy closing in. I glanced at Ellis's cot, his feverish form still under the partition. Priority again, because of the tags he wore, the lie he lived. I wanted to hate him, but all I felt was a hollow ache. As we prepared the first truck, a medic burst in, his face pale. They're closer than we thought. Artillery's shifting, sounds like they're targeting the road. My stomach dropped. The road was our only way out, a narrow dirt track barely wide enough for the trucks. If the enemy hit it, we'd be trapped. Reynolds barked orders, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. Load who you can now. We roll in 10. 10 minutes? 10 minutes to decide who lived, who died, who we could carry through the mud and rain to a chance at survival. I ran to Wilkins, checking his vitals. His pulse was weak but there, his stump no longer bleeding. He could make it, if we had room. I moved to Ellis next, his fever worse, his bandages seeping yellow with infection. I changed them quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, meeting mine. You know, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the shouts and the distant rumble of artillery. You know who I am. I nodded, unable to speak. I knew he wasn't Harlan, knew he'd taken a dead man's name. But did it matter now, with the enemy so close? Why didn't you tell them? He asked, his gaze piercing. I didn't have an answer. Maybe because his secret felt like mine now, a shared sin in this hell. Or maybe because, despite everything, I saw the man who'd hesitated to spare lives, not just the coward who'd lied. Save who you can, he said suddenly, his hand gripping mine. Not me. I'm not worth it. His words echoed Malone's death, the choice I'd made hours ago. I pulled away, shaking my head. You're going on the truck, I said firmly. Priority. The word tasted bitter, but it was protocol. I called for a stretcher, helping medics lift him, his body limp but heavy with the weight of his truth. As we carried him to the truck, Wilkins's voice called out, weak but insistent. Nurse, is that Harlan? I hesitated, glancing at Ellis, then back at Wilkins. Yes, I lied, the word burning my throat. Wilkins nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Tell him we did good. Tell him we saved those people. The lie settled in my chest like a stone. I helped load Ellis onto the truck, his cot wedged beside Tommy's. The boy looked at me, his eyes pleading. Don't leave me, he whispered, echoing his earlier fear. I squeezed his hand, promising to stay close, but my gaze kept drifting to Ellis. His secret was a ticking bomb, one that could destroy more than just him if it came out. As the first truck rumbled to life, its engine straining against the mud, a new sound cut through the drizzle, a low, ominous hum, like a swarm of hornets. Enemy planes. My heart seized. Get down! Someone shouted, and I dove beside the truck, pulling Tommy's stretcher with me. The hum grew louder, then deafening as bombs began to fall, closer than ever. The ground shook, dirt and shrapnel spraying the tent. Screams erupted, medics and nurses scrambling for cover. I shielded Tommy, my body over his, praying the truck wouldn't take a direct hit. Ellis groaned beside us, his fevered eyes open, staring at the sky. This is it, he muttered. Judgment. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he'd lied, why he'd put me in this position. But there was no time. The bombs stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving an eerie silence broken only by moans and the crackle of fires nearby. The truck was intact, but the road ahead was cratered, barely passable. Reynolds appeared, his face grim. We move now, or we don't move at all. As we scrambled to secure the wounded, I realized the choice wasn't just about who to save, it was about who to trust. Ellis's secret, Wilkins's faith, my own guilt, they were all colliding in this moment, with the enemy closing in. And as the truck lurched forward, carrying Ellis and Tommy into the uncertain dawn, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure, moving through the jungle, too deliberate to be a civilian. My blood ran cold. The enemy wasn't just coming, they were already here. The truck lurched through the mud, its engine groaning under the weight of the wounded packed inside like sardines in a tin. I clung to the side, my boots slipping on the slick running board, my hands gripping the frame to keep from falling. The jungle pressed in on all sides, a wall of dark green that seemed to pulse with menace, its shadows hiding the figure I'd glimpsed moments ago, a fleeting silhouette, too purposeful to be anything but trouble. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and diesel, the drizzle mixing with sweat on my face as I scanned the trees. Tommy lay on a stretcher inside, his eyes wide with fear, his bandaged leg trembling. Beside him, Ellis, still wearing Lieutenant Harlan's tags, muttered feverishly, his infection worsening with every jolt of the truck. The other wounded groaned, their voices a low hum of pain that blended with the engine's roar. The road was a nightmare, cratered from the recent bombing, and each bump sent a jolt through my bones, a reminder of how fragile our escape was. Captain Reynolds rode in the cab, shouting directions to the driver, a young private who gripped the wheel like it was his lifeline. Behind us, a second truck followed, carrying more wounded, including Wilkins, whose story of the outpost still haunted me. His belief in Harlan as a hero clashed with Ellis's confession, and the dissonance gnawed at my soul. I'd lied to Wilkins, called Ellis by the stolen name, and now that lie was packed into this truck, rolling toward an uncertain fate. The enemy was close, too close. The hum of planes had faded, but the jungle itself felt alive with threat. Every rustle of leaves a potential sniper. Every snap of a twig a step closer to disaster. We'd barely made it a mile when it happened. A crack split the air, sharp and unmistakable. Gunfire. The driver swore, the truck swerving as bullets pinged off the metal frame. "Ambush!" Reynolds shouted, his voice barely audible over the sudden chaos. I ducked low, my heart hammering, and grabbed Tommy's stretcher, pulling it closer to the floorboards. "Stay down!" I yelled, my voice lost in the cacophony of screams and gunfire. The jungle erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the trees like fireflies, the enemy invisible but everywhere. Bullets tore through the canvas cover of the truck, shredding it like paper. A medic beside me grunted, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed through his uniform. I reached for him, but another volley forced me down, my face pressed into the muddy floor, Tommy's hand gripping mine. The truck lurched to a stop, the engine coughing as if wounded itself. Reynolds leapt from the cab, his pistol drawn, shouting orders to return fire. The few able-bodied soldiers with us, medics and drivers mostly, grabbed rifles, their faces pale but determined. I crawled to the edge of the truck, peering out. The second truck had stopped behind us, its canvas pocked with bullet holes. I couldn't see Wilkins, but I prayed he was still alive. The gunfire was relentless, coming from both sides of the road, the jungle a living trap. "They've got us pinned!" Reynolds yelled, ducking behind a wheel. "We need to move the wounded off the road." But there was nowhere to go, just dense jungle, and the enemy within it. I turned to Tommy, his eyes pleading. "We're gonna die, aren't we?" he whispered. I shook my head, forcing confidence I didn't feel. "Not today, Tommy. Stay with me." I glanced at Ellis, his face slick with sweat, his eyes half open but unfocused. "Ellis," I hissed, shaking him. "Can you move?" He groaned, his hand fumbling for mine. "Leave me," he muttered. "Not worth it." I ignored him, checking his bandages, still seeping, but he could survive if we got out of this. Priority again. The word mocked me, but I couldn't let him die, not after everything. I grabbed a medic's arm, a boy barely older than Tommy. "Help me get them off the truck," I shouted. He nodded, fear in his eyes, and we started dragging stretchers, starting with Tommy. The gunfire didn't let up, bullets whizzing past like angry wasps. I heard a scream from the second truck, then silence, a bad sign. As we pulled Tommy into the ditch beside the road, I saw movement in the trees, closer now. Shadows, figures advancing. Japanese soldiers, their bayonets glinting in the faint dawn light. My stomach churned. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and burdened with wounded who couldn't run. I looked back at the truck where Ellis still lay, too weak to move himself. The medic was struggling with another stretcher, his hands shaking. "Go," I told him. "Get Tommy to cover." He hesitated, then obeyed, dragging Tommy deeper into the ditch. I climbed back into the truck, my heart in my throat. Ellis's eyes met mine, clearer now despite the fever. "Why?" he whispered, echoing his earlier question. "Why save me again?" I didn't answer, couldn't. I grabbed his stretcher, pulling with all my strength, but he was heavy, and the truck's floor was slick with blood and mud. A bullet tore through the canvas inches from my head, and I dropped, covering Ellis with my body. "We're getting out," I growled, more to myself than him. But as I struggled to move him, a new sound cut through the gunfire, a low, guttural shout in a language I didn't understand. The enemy was closing in. Reynolds appeared at the truck's tailgate, his face streaked with dirt and blood. "We're holding them, but not for long," he shouted. "Get the officer out!" Officer? The word stung. He meant Ellis, still wearing Harlan's tags. I nodded, adrenaline surging, and with a strength I didn't know I had, I dragged Ellis's stretcher to the edge. Reynolds helped me lower him into the ditch, where Tommy and the medic crouched, their faces pale. But as we moved, a figure emerged from the trees. A Japanese soldier, his rifle raised. Time slowed. I saw his face, young, almost boyish, not unlike Malone's. He hesitated just for a second, his eyes locking with mine. I froze, my hands on Ellis's stretcher, waiting for the shot. It didn't come. Another soldier shouted something, and the boy turned, disappearing back into the jungle. A moment of mercy or a trick? I didn't have time to wonder. Reynolds grabbed my arm, pulling me down as more gunfire erupted. "Move!" he roared. We scrambled, dragging Ellis and Tommy deeper into the ditch, the mud swallowing us up to our knees. The truck behind us took another hit, its fuel tank igniting in a fireball that lit up the dawn. Screams followed, ours, theirs, I couldn't tell. The second truck was gone, Wilkins with it. My heart sank, but there was no time to grieve. We huddled in the ditch, the gunfire sporadic now, the enemy either retreating or regrouping. Ellis coughed, his hand finding mine again. "You should have left me," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I'm not who you think." I glared at him, anger flaring. "I know who you are," I snapped, "and you're not dying here." But as I said it, I heard footsteps in the jungle, closing in again. The ambush wasn't over, and the secret Ellis carried felt heavier than ever. If we survived this, what would his truth cost us? And as the shadows moved closer, I realized the next moments would force a choice even harder than the one I'd made in the tent. The ditch was a cold, muddy grave, the walls slick with rain and blood, pressing us in as the jungle around us pulsed with danger. I crouched low, my body shielding Tommy's stretcher, his shallow breaths a faint reassurance that he was still alive. Beside us, Ellis lay on his stretcher, his feverish eyes darting toward the trees, his hand still clutching mine with a grip that felt like both a plea and a warning. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke from the burning truck, its flames casting flickering shadows that danced across the faces of the few survivors huddled with us, Reynolds, the young medic, and a handful of wounded who could still move. The second truck was a smoldering wreck, and with it, my hope that Wilkins had survived. His faith in Harlan haunted me, a bitter counterpoint to Ellis's confession. The gunfire had slowed, but the footsteps in the jungle were louder now, deliberate, closing in. The enemy wasn't done with us. Reynolds knelt beside me, his pistol trembling in his hand, his face a mask of grim determination. "They're circling," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the drizzle and the distant crackle of the fire. "We can't stay here. If they flank us, we're done." I nodded, my throat tight. The ditch offered cover, but it was a trap, pinning us against the ruined road with nowhere to run. The wounded couldn't move fast, and carrying stretchers through the jungle with the enemy so close was suicide. But staying meant certain death. I glanced at Tommy, his eyes half closed, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Then at Ellis, his fever making him shiver despite the heat, his stolen tags glinting in the firelight. "What do we do?" I asked Reynolds, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the trees, where shadows shifted like ghosts. "We make a stand," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "Hold them off long enough to get the wounded to the fallback point. There's a clearing a half-mile west, where evac choppers might reach us. Might." The word hung heavy, a fragile thread of hope in a world unraveling. I looked at the men around us, exhausted, injured, outnumbered. A stand sounded like a last gasp, but what choice did we have? "I'll help," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Reynolds nodded, handing me a rifle from a fallen soldier. It was heavy, foreign in my hands, a nurse's hands meant for healing, not killing. But this was war, and war didn't care about my training. We positioned ourselves along the ditch, the able-bodied forming a ragged line. Reynolds took point, directing the medic and 2 wounded soldiers who could still shoot to spread out. I stayed near Tommy and Ellis, the rifle awkward against my shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The jungle was quieter now, the footsteps replaced by an eerie silence that felt more threatening than the gunfire. They were out there watching, waiting. I glanced at Ellis, his eyes meeting mine. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice weak. "Not for me," I shook my head, anger flaring. "I'm not doing it for you," I snapped, though part of me wasn't sure. Was I fighting to save him, to save Tommy, or to prove something to myself? That I wasn't the woman who'd let Malone die for a lie? The attack came without warning. A burst of gunfire erupted from the trees, bullets tearing through the air, kicking up mud inches from my face. I dropped lower, my cheek pressed against the cold earth, the rifle shaking in my hands. Reynolds fired back, his shots precise, and I heard a cry from the jungle. Someone hit. The medic beside me returned fire, his face pale but focused. "Keep low!" Reynolds shouted, and I obeyed, my eyes scanning for Tommy. He was still on his stretcher, his hands covering his ears, his body curled as if he could make himself smaller. Ellis was silent, his breathing labored, but his eyes were open, watching me. "You're no coward," he murmured, and I didn't know if he meant me or himself. The enemy advanced, their shouts growing louder. Their figures breaking through the trees now, dark shapes moving fast, bayonets fixed. My stomach churned. I'd seen what bayonets could do, the jagged wounds they left, worse than bullets. I raised the rifle, my hands slick with sweat, and fired blindly into the jungle. The recoil jolted my shoulder, the sound deafening, but I didn't know if I'd hit anything. Reynolds was shouting orders, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. "Hold the line! Protect the wounded!" I fired again, my heart racing, my mind screaming that this wasn't me, this wasn't what I was meant to do. But war didn't care about meant to be. A soldier broke through the line, his bayonet gleaming as he charged toward the ditch. Time slowed again, just like with the boy in the trees earlier. His face was young, too young, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and fury. I raised my rifle, my finger on the trigger, but I couldn't shoot. Not at him. Not at another face like Malone's. Reynolds didn't hesitate. His pistol cracked and the soldier fell, a red bloom spreading across his chest. I gasped, my hands shaking, the rifle slipping in my grip. "Focus!" Reynolds barked, but his voice was distant, drowned by the pounding in my ears. The fight was brutal, chaotic. We held them off, but at a cost. The medic took a bullet to the leg, collapsing beside me with a cry. I dropped the rifle, crawling to him, my hands searching for the wound. Blood pulsed under my fingers, arterial, bad. I tore a strip from my apron, tying a tourniquet as he groaned, his face gray. "Stay with me," I said, echoing words I'd said too many times tonight. Behind me, Tommy whimpered, and Ellis muttered something incoherent. The gunfire was thinning now, the enemy pulling back, but we were running out of time, out of men, out of everything. Reynolds crawled over, his face streaked with blood. Not his, I realized with relief. "They're retreating," he panted. "But they'll be back. We need to move now." I nodded, my body aching, my mind numb. We started dragging the wounded toward the jungle, toward the clearing Reynolds had mentioned. Tommy's stretcher was light, his small frame easier to carry. Ellis was heavier, his infection sapping his strength, but we managed, Reynolds and I taking turns. The medic limped, leaning on a wounded soldier who'd found a second wind. The jungle swallowed us, its vines and roots tripping us. The darkness hiding us from the enemy, for now. As we stumbled forward, Ellis grabbed my arm, his eyes burning with fever and something else, urgency. "If we make it," he whispered, "you need to know the rest. About Harlan, about me." I didn't want to hear it, didn't want another secret to carry, but I nodded. The truth was a burden, but it was mine now. And as we pushed toward the clearing, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind us, I realized the next moments would test not just our survival, but the very humanity I was fighting to hold on to. The jungle was a living beast, its vines snagging at our feet, its branches clawing at the stretchers as we stumbled toward the clearing. My arms burned from carrying Ellis's stretcher, his weight dragging me down with every step, his feverish mutterings a constant reminder of the secret he carried, and the one I now bore. Tommy's stretcher was lighter, but his soft whimpers cut through me, each one a plea for a safety I couldn't promise. Captain Reynolds led the way, his pistol still in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the enemy. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, crashing branches, distant shouts in a language that sent chills down my spine. The ambush had thinned our numbers, and the survivors, me, Reynolds, the wounded medic, a few soldiers, and the stretchers, were all that remained of our desperate flight from the hospital tent. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder, the drizzle soaking through my uniform, chilling me to the bone despite the tropical heat. The clearing was closer now, a faint break in the jungle's oppressive canopy where the gray dawn light filtered through. Reynolds had said choppers might reach us there, but might was a fragile hope, and the weight of our reality pressed down harder with every step. The medic limped beside me, his leg wound slowing him, his face a mask of pain and determination. "Keep moving," I urged, my voice hoarse. He nodded, gripping a rifle he could barely hold. The wounded soldiers who could walk staggered along, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. We were a ragged band, carrying our burdens through a world that wanted us dead. Ellis stirred on his stretcher, his hand finding mine again, his grip weak but insistent. "Almost there," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the jungle's hum. Tell them the truth." I didn't respond, couldn't. His confession, that he wasn't Lilton Harlan, that he'd taken a dead man's tags to survive, had shattered my sense of right and wrong. Wilkins's belief in Harlan as a hero, his story of the outpost where hesitation saved civilians, clashed with Ellis's self-proclaimed cowardice. And yet I'd saved him again and again, because of those tags, because of protocol, because of a choice I couldn't undo. Malone's face flashed in my mind, his freckles stark against his lifeless skin, and I stumbled, the stretcher dipping. Reynolds caught it, his eyes meeting mine. "Stay focused," he said. But there was no judgment in his voice, only exhaustion. We broke into the clearing. A small patch of open ground surrounded by towering trees. The mud underfoot churned from earlier rains. The sky above was a dull gray, the clouds low and heavy, promising more rain. No choppers, no hum of engines, just silence, broken by our ragged breathing and the distant crack of branches. Reynolds signaled for us to stop, lowering Tommy's stretcher gently to the ground. I set Ellis's down beside it, checking his bandages. The infection was worse, the yellow seepage spreading, his skin burning under my touch. "Hold on," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to, him, Tommy, or myself. The medic collapsed nearby, clutching his leg, and the other soldiers fanned out, rifles ready, watching the tree line. Reynolds knelt beside me, his face grim. "If the choppers don't come soon, we're sitting ducks," he said. "Enemies tracking us. We can't outrun them with the wounded." I nodded, my throat tight. The clearing was a trap as much as a hope, exposed and vulnerable. I looked at Tommy, his eyes fluttering open, his lips trembling. "Are we safe?" he asked, his voice small. I forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "We're gonna be fine," I lied, the words tasting like ash. But as I spoke, a low drone cut through the air, faint but growing louder. Choppers. My heart leapt, but Reynolds's face didn't change. "Might not be ours," he warned, his eyes on the sky. The drone grew, and with it, the sounds of pursuit, footsteps, closer now, crashing through the jungle. The enemy hadn't given up. Reynolds stood, barking orders to the soldiers. "Form a perimeter! Protect the wounded!" The men moved, their rifles raised, but they were too few, too tired. I stayed with Tommy and Ellis, my hands on the rifle I'd carried from the ambush, its weight still foreign. The drone of the choppers was louder now, unmistakable, but so were the shouts from the trees. The jungle erupted again, gunfire cracking, bullets tearing through the clearing. One soldier fell, clutching his chest, and I screamed, dropping beside Tommy to shield him. Reynolds fired back, his pistol steady, but the enemy was everywhere. Their figures breaking through the trees, bayonets gleaming. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking, but before I could fire, Ellis grabbed my arm. "Don't!" he gasped, his eyes wild. Not worth it. Let me... He tried to sit up, his strength failing, but his words hit me. He wanted to be left, to be the sacrifice. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. No, I said fiercely. You're not dying here. But as I spoke, a figure loomed over the ditch, a Japanese soldier, his rifle aimed at us. I froze, time slowing again, his face young and hard, like the boy from the ambush. He hesitated, just like before, his eyes flicking from me to Ellis to Tommy. Then a shot rang out, not from him, but from Reynolds. The soldier fell and I gasped, my hands trembling on the rifle. The choppers were overhead now, their roar deafening, their blades chopping the air. I looked up, praying they were ours. American markings glinted in the dawn light, and relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The enemy pressed closer, their gunfire relentless. Reynolds shouted, "Get the wounded ready!" I helped lift Tommy's stretcher, my arms screaming, and signaled the medic to help with Ellis. But as we moved, Ellis grabbed my hand again, his voice urgent. "The truth," he rasped. "Harlan, he wasn't just anyone. He was my brother." The words hit like a bomb. "Brother?" I stared at him, my mind reeling. "What?" I whispered, but he was fading, his eyes closing. "Took his tags. To carry him on," he murmured. "Tell them." He was the hero. The choppers landed, their downdraft blasting mud and leaves, and medics poured out, grabbing stretchers. I helped load Tommy, then Ellis, shouting his condition. Fever, infection, critical. The medics nodded, moving fast, but as they lifted Ellis, his hand slipped from mine, his eyes shut. I didn't know if he'd make it. The gunfire was fading, the enemy retreating under the chopper's cover, but the clearing was a graveyard, soldiers down, blood pooling in the mud. I climbed aboard the chopper with Tommy, holding his hand as we lifted off, the jungle shrinking below. Ellis was on another, his fate uncertain. His final confession, Harlan, his brother, burned in my mind, a truth that reframed everything. Had he taken the tags to honor him or to escape? Was he coward or protector? The chopper's roar drowned my thoughts, but not the question, why him and not Malone? As we flew toward safety, the jungle a green blur below, I realized the war wasn't done with me. Ellis's secret, Tommy's fear, my choices, they were part of me now, scars that would never fade. And as the chopper banked, carrying us away from the clearing but not from the truth, I knew the final reckoning was still to come. The chopper's blades thumped above me, a relentless heartbeat that couldn't drown out the echoes of the night before. I sat beside Tommy, his hand limp in mine, his eyes closed as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The medics worked on the other wounded, their movements swift but strained, their faces etched with the same exhaustion I felt in my bones. Through the chopper's open door, the jungle stretched endlessly below, a green sea swallowing the horrors we'd left behind, the burning trucks, the blood-soaked clearing, the faces of those we couldn't save. Somewhere in another chopper was Ellis, if he was still alive, his fever and his secrets weighing on me like a stone I couldn't set down. His final confession, that Lieutenant Harlan was his brother, that he'd taken his tags to carry him on, had shattered the last of my certainty. Was he a coward hiding behind a hero's name, or a man trying to honor a brother lost to war's cruelty? And me, what was I, after choosing him over Malone, after carrying his lie through the jungle, after fighting to save a man whose truth I might never fully understand? The hospital tent, the ambush, the clearing, they were moments carved into my soul, each one a question I couldn't answer. Why did I save him and not Malone? Was it rank, instinct, or something deeper, something war forced me to become? I'd come to the Pacific as a nurse, believing I could heal, that my hands could hold back death. But war doesn't let you heal without breaking you first. It strips you bare, exposes the raw edges of your humanity, and demands choices that haunt you long after the bombs stop falling. Malone's freckled face, Tommy's trembling hand, Ellis's fevered eyes, they were mirrors reflecting my own fragility, my own failures. And yet, in that chaos, I'd found moments of connection. Tommy calling me an angel. Wilkins's faith in a hero who wasn't what he seemed. Even Ellis's confession, raw and unfiltered, trusting me with a truth that could have destroyed him. As the chopper carried us toward a rear base, The jungle fading into the distance, I realized the question wasn't just about Ellis or Malone. It was about all of us, soldiers, nurses, enemies, caught in a machine that ground up lives and spat out secrets. War doesn't just kill, it reshapes you, forces you to decide who you are when the world is burning. I'd chosen to save Ellis, not because of his stolen tags, but because in that moment I saw a man who'd hesitated, who'd spared lives even at the cost of his own men. Was that heroism or cowardice? Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what war does. It blurs the lines until you can't tell right from wrong, only survival from surrender. I don't know if Ellis survived. The chopper took him to a different hospital, and in the chaos of evacuation, I lost track. Tommy made it, his leg wound healing slowly, his eyes still carrying the fear of that night. I visited him when I could, his small smiles a reminder of why I kept going. But the question, why did you save him and not me, never left me. It wasn't just Ellis's voice or Malone's ghost. It was mine, asking if I'd made the right choice, if I'd been strong enough, human enough, to carry the weight of those decisions. War doesn't give you answers, only scars. And I've carried mine for years, each one a story of survival, loss, and the truths we bury to keep going. You've followed me through this darkness, through the blood and the bombs, the lies and the lives that hung in the balance. That takes courage. Not the kind that fires a rifle or charges an outpost, but the kind that dares to listen, to face the raw, ugly truth of what war does to the human soul. You're part of a rare group now, one that doesn't shy away from the stories too many try to forget. I'm asking you to honor that courage, to keep this story alive. In the comments below, write this. This story changed the way I see war. Those words aren't just a comment. They're a declaration that you're one of us. A listener who values the voices that emerge from conflict, who seeks to understand the cost of survival. By sharing that, you're building a community that refuses to let these truths be silenced. But don't stop there. Share this video with someone you know, someone who needs to hear what war really is beyond the headlines and the history books. Let them feel the weight of that tent, the jungle, the choices that define us. War isn't just a battle, it's a mirror, showing us who we are when everything else is stripped away. By sharing, you're giving others a chance to look into that mirror, to see the resilience and the pain that shape us all. And if this story has stirred something in you, a question, a memory, a spark, subscribe to this channel. Join us in this journey to uncover the voices that war tries to bury. Think of it as stepping into the jungle with us, facing the shadows, seeking the truth. It's not easy, but it's vital. War reveals the fragility of life, the strength of the human spirit, and the secrets we carry to survive. Keep listening, keep searching, because these stories, they're not just mine. They're ours,